In a quiet little neighborhood on the edge of a bustling town, life moved at its own peaceful pace. The streets were lined with perfectly trimmed lawns, colorful flower beds, and houses that looked like they'd been plucked straight out of a home decor magazine. It was the kind of place where people waved to each other in the mornings, kids rode their bikes down winding roads, and weekend barbecues brought everyone together. At first glance, it seemed like the perfect suburban dream, a haven where families could thrive and friendships blossomed naturally. But behind this picture-perfect facade lay secrets, tensions, and simmering conflicts that no one dared to talk about openly. This idyllic community wasn't as harmonious as it appeared. In fact, there was one issue that had been quietly dividing the residents for years. An old weathered farm sitting right at the edge of the neighborhood. The farm didn't belong to any developer or corporation. It belonged to an elderly woman named Margaret Harper, who had lived there her entire life. Margaret's farm stood out like a sore thumb amidst all the modern homes. While her neighbors prided themselves on pristine lawns and freshly painted fences, Margaret's property was wild and untamed. Tall grass swayed in the breeze, rusted farming equipment lay scattered around, and the barn, though sturdy, showed signs of wear and tear. To some it was charming, a relic of simpler times, but to others it was an eyesore, a blight on the otherwise flawless landscape of the neighborhood. The Homeowners Association, HOA, a group responsible for maintaining the aesthetic standards of the area, had long taken issue with Margaret's refusal to conform. They sent her polite reminders asking her to tidy up her yard, fix the sagging roof of the barn, and paint the wooden fence. But Margaret never complied. She wasn't being stubborn just for the sake of it. She simply couldn't bear to change the place she called home. Every corner of the farm held memories of her late husband, who had built much of it with his own hands. For Margaret, the farm wasn't just land. It was a living testament to her love story, her struggles, and her triumphs. Over time, the HOA grew increasingly frustrated with Margaret's defiance. What started as gentle nudges turned into more aggressive demands. Meetings were held to discuss the problem, and letters were drafted urging Margaret to sell her property. Developers had approached her multiple times, offering sums of money that would make most people jump at the opportunity. But Margaret always declined. Money meant nothing to her compared to the sentimental value of the farm. Her steadfastness only fueled the HOA's determination to get rid of her. Tensions between Margaret and the HOA began to spill over into the rest of the neighborhood. Some residents sympathized with Margaret, admiring her loyalty to her roots and her willingness to stand her ground. Others, however, sided with the HOA, believing that Margaret's refusal to sell was holding back progress. After all, developers had big plans for that land: luxury condos, shopping centers, maybe even a park. These projects promised to boost property values and bring new amenities to the area. To them, Margaret's farm was a roadblock standing in the way of prosperity. Despite the growing divide, life in the neighborhood continued as usual, or so it seemed. Beneath the surface, resentment brewed. Anonymous notes started appearing in Margaret's mailbox, some pleading with her to reconsider, others laced with thinly veiled threats. Late-night phone calls disturbed her peace, though she rarely picked up. One morning she woke up to find graffiti scrawled across her barn door: "Sell or leave." The bold red letters sent chills down her spine. But instead of backing down, Margaret resolved to fight harder. She reported the vandalism to the police, but without concrete evidence, there was little they could do. As days turned into weeks, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. Conversations became hushed. Glances, exchanged between neighbors, carried unspoken accusations, and the once friendly vibe gave way to an uneasy tension. Children stopped playing near the farm, and adults avoided crossing paths with Margaret altogether. The HOA, meanwhile, doubled down on its efforts to pressure her into selling. Closed-door meetings became frequent, and whispers circulated about drastic measures if Margaret refused to budge. While Margaret remained isolated and determined, few realized how deeply the conflict was affecting the community. Friendships frayed, alliances formed, and distrust spread like wildfire. No one knew exactly what the future held, but one thing was certain: The feud over the farm had changed the neighborhood forever, and as the sun set each evening, casting long shadows over the fields of Margaret's beloved land, it felt as though the calm before a storm was drawing to an end. Something was bound to happen, and when it did, it would shake the very foundation of the seemingly perfect suburb. Margaret Harper was not the kind of person who sought attention or drama. She was a quiet, reserved woman in her late 70s, with silver hair tied neatly in a bun and hands that bore the marks of decades spent tending to crops and animals. Her life had been simple but fulfilling, waking up early to feed chickens, planting vegetables in spring, and sitting on her porch in the evenings watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. The farm wasn't just her home, it was her sanctuary, a place where she felt closest to her late husband, Thomas. Thomas had been the heart and soul of the farm. Together they had poured their blood, sweat, and tears into making it thrive. He had built the barn himself, hammering nails and sawing wood until his hands blistered. They had planted every tree, fixed every fence, and nurtured every patch of soil together. When Thomas passed away 10 years ago, Margaret vowed never to let go of the land they had created together. It was more than property. It was a living memory of their love. But now that same land had become a battleground. The neighborhood around her had changed dramatically over the years. Once surrounded by open fields and scattered farms, Margaret's property was now encircled by rows of modern homes, manicured lawns, and shiny cars parked in driveways. The suburban sprawl had crept closer and closer, swallowing up the countryside bit by bit. Developers saw dollar signs whenever they looked at her land, envisioning luxury condos, shopping centers, or parks that could attract new buyers to the area. For Margaret, selling was out of the question. No amount of money could replace what she would lose if she gave up the farm. To her, it wasn't about profit or convenience, it was about preserving a piece of her past, a connection to the life she had shared with Thomas. Every blade of grass, every creaky floorboard in the farmhouse, and every rusted tool in the shed told a story. Selling would mean erasing those stories forever. The pressure from the Homeowners Association, HOA, only intensified as time went on. At first, their requests were polite enough. Trim the hedges, repaint the barn, maybe clear out some of the old machinery cluttering the yard. But when Margaret politely declined, citing her age and limited resources, the tone shifted. Letters arrived more frequently, each one firmer than the last. Then came visits from HOA representatives, knocking on her door with rehearsed smiles and thinly veiled ultimatums. "Mrs. Harper," they'd say, "we're just trying to keep the neighborhood looking nice for everyone." But beneath their cheerful demeanor lurked an undercurrent of impatience, and something darker. One afternoon, a developer named Mr. Grayson showed up unannounced. Dressed in an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase, he introduced himself as someone eager to help Margaret secure her financial future. He spread glossy brochures across her kitchen table, showcasing sleek renderings of what her land could become: a gated community with swimming pools, tennis courts, and sprawling villas. His voice dripped with charm as he explained how much money she could make. "Think about it, Mrs. Harper," he said, leaning forward. "You could live comfortably for the rest of your life without having to worry about upkeep or bills." Margaret listened silently, her expression unreadable. When he finished his pitch, she simply shook her head. "This land isn't for sale," she said firmly. Her tone left no room for negotiation. Frustrated but unwilling to give up, Mr. Grayson tried again, raising his offer significantly. Still, Margaret refused. Finally exasperated, he stood up, gathered his papers, and muttered something about how stubbornness wasn't practical. As he walked away, slamming the screen door behind him, Margaret felt a pang of sadness. Not because she doubted her decision, but because she knew this wouldn't be the last time someone tried to convince her otherwise. Word of Margaret's refusal spread quickly among the neighbors. Some admired her resolve, whispering that she had every right to keep her land. Others, however, grew resentful. Conversations at dinner tables turned sour as people debated whether Margaret was being selfish. "She's holding us back," one neighbor complained during a heated discussion at a block party. We could have better amenities, higher property values, maybe even a park for the kids. The HOA board seized on these sentiments, using them to justify their increasingly aggressive tactics. Flyers appeared in mailboxes urging residents to support efforts to acquire Margaret's land. Meetings were held to discuss strategies, ranging from offering even larger sums of money to exploring legal options like eminent domain. A few members suggested less savory methods, though they whispered about those ideas behind closed doors. Despite the mounting pressure, Margaret remained steadfast. She spent her days tending to her garden, feeding the chickens, and occasionally chatting with the few neighbors who still visited her. She ignored the nasty notes slipped into her mailbox and blocked unknown numbers on her phone. At night, she sat by the window, staring out at the fields bathed in moonlight, wondering how long she could hold on. One evening, as she sipped tea on her porch, a young boy approached her gate. It was Ethan, her grandson, visiting for the weekend. He was a college student studying journalism, full of energy and curiosity. Seeing the worry lines etched on his grandmother's face, he asked, "Grandma, are you okay? Do you want me to help?" Margaret smiled weakly. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired of fighting." Ethan frowned. "You shouldn't have to fight alone. Maybe I can look into this, find out what's really going on." Though skeptical, Margaret nodded. She trusted Ethan's determination and sharp mind. Little did she know, his involvement would soon turn the tide in ways neither of them could have imagined. For now, though, Margaret focused on keeping her spirits high. She reminded herself why she was doing this, for Thomas, for the memories, and for the belief that some things are worth protecting, no matter the cost. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues over the farm, Margaret took a deep breath. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she allowed herself a moment of peace. This land was hers, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away, not without a fight. The tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point as the days turned into weeks. Margaret's quiet defiance became the talk of every gathering, from coffee mornings to evening walks. The HOA board members, who had once prided themselves on maintaining harmony, found themselves at odds with each other. Some argued that they needed to be more aggressive, while others hesitated, fearing backlash if things escalated further. But one thing was clear. The issue of Margaret Harper's farm wasn't going away anytime soon. Anonymous letters began appearing in Margaret's mailbox almost daily. At first, they were polite requests written in flowery language urging her to consider the greater good and join hands with your neighbors for progress. But as time passed, the tone shifted. The notes grew sharper, angrier, and more personal. One read, "You're selfishly holding back our community. Sell now or face consequences." Another simply said, "Move on, old woman, this isn't your world anymore." Margaret tried not to let these messages get to her, but they gnawed at her peace of mind. She recognized some handwriting styles, from neighbors she'd known for years, people she'd waved to, shared recipes with, and even invited over for tea. It hurt deeply to think that those same people now saw her as an obstacle, rather than a fellow resident. Still, she refused to give in. Instead, she tucked the letters into a shoebox under her bed, saving them as evidence should the situation worsen. Late-night phone calls added another layer of stress to her life. Her landline would ring at odd hours, jolting her awake. Most of the time, there was only silence on the other end, followed by the sound of someone hanging up abruptly. Occasionally, a voice would mutter vague threats like, "This is your last chance," before disconnecting. Margaret stopped answering altogether, letting the answering machine pick up. Yet, even knowing it was unlikely anyone would harm her, directly didn't stop the unease from creeping in. One particularly unsettling incident occurred when Margaret woke up early one morning to find graffiti sprayed across her barn door. In bold red letters it read, "Sell or leave." The message was stark against the faded wood, impossible to ignore. Margaret stood frozen, staring at it for several minutes before anger slowly replaced shock. Who could have done this? And why go so far as to vandalize her property? She called the police immediately, But their response offered little comfort. An officer arrived within the hour, took photos of the graffiti, and asked routine questions about potential suspects. When Margaret admitted she didn't know who might be responsible, the officer sighed. "Without evidence or witnesses, there's not much we can do," he said apologetically. He assured her they'd file a report and keep an eye on the area, but his tone suggested he didn't expect much to come of it. Frustrated yet determined, Margaret cleaned off the graffiti herself later that day. Armed with soap, water, and a scrub brush, she worked tirelessly under the scorching sun until the paint finally faded away. As sweat dripped down her face, she muttered to herself, "They won't win. Not like this." Meanwhile, whispers spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People speculated about who could have defaced the barn. Some blamed teenagers looking for trouble, while others suspected disgruntled HOA members taking matters into their own hands. A few even wondered aloud if Margaret herself had staged the vandalism to gain sympathy, a ridiculous accusation that made her blood boil when she heard about it later. At HOA meetings, tempers flared as discussions around Margaret's farm grew, increasingly heated. Richard Langley, the board president, paced back and forth during one such meeting, his usually calm demeanor cracking under pressure. "We've tried everything," he exclaimed, slamming his fist on the table. "Polite requests, generous offers, legal advice. We've bent over backward and still she refuses to cooperate." Other board members chimed in, their voices overlapping in frustration. "It's not just about her anymore," said Linda Carlson, the treasurer. "Our property values are suffering because of this. People are starting to question whether living here is worth it." "What else can we do?" asked another member, throwing up his hands. "Short of dragging her out ourselves, I don't see how we'll resolve this." Richard paused, rubbing his temples. His gaze darted around the room, landing briefly on each person present. Finally, he spoke in a low, deliberate voice. "There may be alternative solutions, options we haven't fully explored yet." He didn't elaborate, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Whatever he meant, it wasn't something he wanted to discuss openly. Outside the meeting, rumors swirled among residents. Some claimed the HOA was considering hiring private contractors to intimidate Margaret further. Others whispered about cutting off utilities to her home or filing nuisance complaints to force her compliance. While no definitive action materialized, the mere possibility sent shivers down spines. Was the HOA truly capable of crossing ethical lines to achieve its goals? Amidst all the chaos, Ethan, Margaret's grandson, decided to step in. Having witnessed the toll this conflict was taking on his grandmother, he felt compelled to help. A journalism student with a knack for research, Ethan began digging deeper into the HOA's activities. He attended public meetings, pretending to write a school project on suburban governance, and struck up conversations with disgruntled former board members. Slowly but surely, pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. Ethan discovered that the HOA had allocated secret funds labeled Land Acquisition Initiatives, which seemed suspicious given their official stance of neutrality. He also uncovered cryptic emails discussing strategies to convince holdout homeowners like Margaret. The more he learned, the angrier he became, not just for his grandmother's sake, but for the broader implications of unchecked power wielded by organizations like the HOA. Determined to shine a light on the truth, Ethan turned to social media. He created a post on Reddit's EntitledPeople forum, sharing snippets of his findings along with photos of the vandalized barn and anonymous hate mail. The thread quickly gained traction, sparking outrage among users nationwide. Comments poured in, condemning the HOA's behavior and rallying support for Margaret. "This is insane," one commenter wrote. "How can they treat someone like this for refusing to sell her own land?" Encouraged by the response, Ethan continued posting updates, keeping the online community engaged. For the first time in months, Margaret felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the tide was beginning to turn in her favor. But as the spotlight grew brighter, so did the risks. The HOA couldn't ignore the mounting pressure forever, and neither could Margaret. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the neighborhood grew heavier, charged with anticipation. Neighbors avoided eye contact, unsure of whom to trust. Friends stopped speaking to one another, divided by differing opinions on Margaret's plight. Even children sensed the tension, playing quieter games and staying closer to home. What had once been a peaceful suburb now felt like a powder keg waiting to explode. For Margaret, the escalating hostility reinforced her resolve. She knew she couldn't fight alone, but she also understood that giving up wasn't an option. Every insult, every threat, every act of vandalism only strengthened her conviction to protect what was hers. Sitting on her porch one evening, watching the sunset bathe her fields in golden light, she whispered softly to herself, "I won't let them take this away, no matter what." Unbeknownst to her, Ethan was already planning his next move. Armed with evidence and fueled by determination, he was ready to expose the HOA's dirty secrets to the world. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Margaret wasn't fighting it alone. It was a chilly autumn evening when disaster struck. The air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. Margaret had spent the day tidying up her garden, pulling out stubborn weeds and stacking firewood near the side of the barn. Exhausted but content, she settled into her favorite chair on the porch to watch the last light fade from the day. As darkness enveloped the farm, she headed inside, locking the door behind her and turning off the porch light. Around midnight, a sudden commotion jolted her awake. At first, she thought it might be another prank, a loud noise, or perhaps kids messing around outside. But then came the unmistakable smell of smoke. Her heart raced as she scrambled out of bed and rushed to the window. What she saw made her blood run cold. Flames were devouring her beloved barn. The fire roared like a living beast, its hungry tongues licking at the wooden structure with terrifying speed. Thick black smoke billowed into the night sky, blotting out the stars. Panicked, Margaret grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her hands trembling so badly she could barely press the numbers. "My barn is on fire," she cried into the receiver. "Please hurry." Within minutes, neighbors began pouring out of their homes, drawn by the glow of the inferno and the acrid stench of burning wood. Some stood frozen in shock, while others tried to help, dousing the flames with garden hoses despite knowing it was futile against such intensity. Children clung to their parents, wide-eyed and frightened as the crackling sound of collapsing beams echoed through the night. Fire trucks arrived soon after, sirens wailing, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. Firefighters sprang into action, battling the blaze with all they had. But the barn was old, dry, and filled with flammable materials, hay bales, tools, and decades' worth of memories. By the time the flames were finally extinguished, nothing remained but charred rubble and ash. Margaret watched helplessly from the sidelines, tears streaming down her face as the reality sank in. Her barn, the heart of her farm, was gone. The next morning, investigators combed through the wreckage, searching for clues about how the fire had started. It didn't take long for them to rule out accidental causes. There were no electrical faults, no signs of spontaneous combustion. The fire had been deliberately set, an act of arson. News of the investigation spread quickly throughout the neighborhood. People gathered in small clusters, whispering theories and speculations. Was this an isolated incident, or part of a larger pattern targeting Margaret? Many suspected foul play, pointing fingers at the HOA and its increasingly aggressive tactics. Others hesitated to jump to conclusions, fearing the implications if someone close to them turned out to be involved. Margaret, meanwhile, struggled to process what had happened. The barn wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of her life with Thomas, a testament to the hard work they had poured into the farm. Now it was reduced to ashes, along with countless irreplaceable items stored inside. Old photographs, handmade furniture, and mementos from decades past. The loss felt unbearable, but even worse was the knowledge that someone had done this intentionally. Someone wanted her gone badly enough to destroy something so precious. Ethan, who had returned to college after his weekend visit, heard about the fire through a frantic call from his grandmother. Horrified, he dropped everything and drove back, home immediately. When he arrived, he found Margaret sitting on the front steps of the farmhouse, staring blankly at the smoldering remains of the barn. She looked frail, defeated, and utterly heartbroken. "Grandma," Ethan said softly, kneeling beside her. "I'm here. We'll figure this out together." Margaret nodded weakly, clutching his hand tightly. For the first time since the ordeal began, she allowed herself to lean on someone else. She told him everything: the anonymous letters, the late-night calls, the graffiti, and shared her growing suspicion that the HOA was behind it all. Though she couldn't prove anything, the timing and circumstances seemed too coincidental to ignore. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan decided to ramp up his efforts. He revisited the documents he'd gathered during his earlier research, looking for any connection between the HOA and potential arsonists. He also reached out to local journalists, hoping to draw more attention to the case. If the HOA thought they could silence Margaret with fear, they were wrong. Ethan vowed to make sure the world knew exactly what was happening. As word of the fire spread beyond the neighborhood, it caught the attention of national media outlets. Reporters descended upon the quiet suburb, eager to tell the story of the elderly woman standing up to her powerful HOA. Cameras rolled as Margaret gave interviews, her voice steady despite the pain etched on her face. "This isn't just about me," she told one reporter. "It's about standing up for what's right. My home, my land, they're not for sale. And no amount of intimidation will change that." The online community rallied around Margaret once again. Ethan's Reddit thread exploded with activity, drawing thousands of comments and shares. Users expressed outrage over the HOA's behavior and offered words of encouragement to Margaret. Some even organized crowdfunding campaigns to help her rebuild the barn and cover legal expenses. Strangers sent letters of support, sharing stories of their own battles against oppressive organizations. For the first time in months, Margaret felt a sense of solidarity, not just from her grandson, but from people across the country who believed in her cause. Back in the neighborhood, however, reactions were mixed. While some residents sympathized with Margaret, others grew defensive, insisting the HOA couldn't possibly be responsible for something so extreme. Richard Langley, the HOA president, issued a carefully worded statement condemning the fire and promising full cooperation with investigators. But his words rang hollow to those who remembered his earlier threats and cryptic remarks about alternative solutions. Behind closed doors, cracks began to form within the HOA itself. Board members whispered nervously about the mounting scrutiny, each trying to distance themselves from blame. Linda Carlson, the treasurer, confided in Ethan during a private meeting, revealing details about secret funds and questionable decisions made by the board. She hinted that contractors had been hired to handle difficult situations before, though she stopped short of naming names. Still, her information provided crucial leads for Ethan to follow. As days turned into weeks, the investigation dragged on, frustrating both Margaret and her supporters. Without concrete evidence, authorities struggled to identify the arsonist. Meanwhile, tensions in the neighborhood reached an all-time high. Neighbors avoided each other, distrustful glances replaced friendly waves, and the once close-knit community unraveled further. Fear lingered in the air, a constant reminder that anyone could be capable of such destruction. Despite the challenges, Margaret refused to give up. With Ethan by her side and a growing army of supporters cheering her on, she vowed to fight back, harder than ever. The barn may have been lost, but her spirit remained unbroken. Sitting amidst the ruins one evening, she looked at Ethan and said firmly, "They can burn down my barn, but they can't burn down my resolve. I'll never sell. Not now. Not ever." And with those words, Margaret Harper became more than just a stubborn old woman clinging to her land. She became a symbol of resilience, courage, and the enduring power of standing up for what you believe in, even when the odds seem insurmountable. The aftermath of the fire left the neighborhood in a state of unease. Margaret's barn, once a symbol of her resilience and connection to her late husband, was now a pile of charred wood and ash. The sight of it served as a grim reminder of how far some people were willing to go to get what they wanted. For Margaret, the loss was devastating, but she refused to let it break her spirit. With Ethan by her side, she resolved to dig deeper into the HOA's activities, determined to uncover the truth behind the arson and expose those responsible. Ethan threw himself into the investigation with relentless energy. A journalism student, with a knack for research, he knew how to ask the right questions and follow trails that others might overlook. He started by attending more HOA meetings, this time armed with a recorder hidden in his pocket. These gatherings had always been tense, but now they carried an undercurrent of paranoia. Board members exchanged nervous glances, their usual confidence, replaced by furtive whispers and guarded expressions. Richard Langley, the HOA president, seemed particularly on edge, his polished demeanor cracking under the weight of scrutiny. During one meeting, Ethan caught snippets of conversation that raised his suspicions even further. "We need to contain this," Richard muttered to another board member, leaning close so no one else could hear. "If the media keeps digging, we're done for." Though vague, the comment hinted at something sinister, a cover-up, or perhaps even complicity in the fire. Ethan made a mental note to investigate Richard's background more thoroughly. Outside of official meetings, Ethan sought out former HOA members who had resigned or been pushed out over the years. One name kept coming up: Linda Carlson, the treasurer, who had quietly stepped down months earlier. Through mutual acquaintances, Ethan managed to arrange a meeting with her at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. Linda arrived looking anxious, constantly checking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to follow her. "I shouldn't be doing this," she said as soon as they sat down, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't live with myself anymore if I don't say something." Over coffee, Linda revealed details about the HOA's inner workings that shocked even Ethan. She explained how the organization had set aside secret funds labeled as community improvement initiatives, which were actually used to pressure holdout homeowners like Margaret. Contractors had been hired to perform tasks ranging from minor annoyances, like cutting power lines or dumping garbage on properties, to more extreme measures, such as vandalism and intimidation. While Linda didn't explicitly confirm that the HOA had orchestrated the fire, she admitted that the board had discussed hiring private firms known for their aggressive tactics. "They thought they could scare her into selling," Linda said, her hands trembling as she stirred sugar into her cup. "I tried to warn them it would backfire, but no one listened. When things got out of hand, I couldn't stay silent anymore. That's why I left." Linda's testimony gave Ethan the ammunition he needed to take the story public. He posted his findings online, sharing screenshots of financial records, emails, and audio clips from the HOA meetings. His Reddit thread blew up almost instantly, drawing thousands of comments and shares. Users praised him for exposing corruption and urged him to keep pushing forward. Some offered tips on where to look next, while others shared similar experiences with their own HOAs, creating a growing network of support. Local news outlets picked up the story, sending reporters to interview Margaret and investigate the allegations against the HOA. Cameras rolled as Margaret stood amidst the ruins of her barn, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "This isn't just about my farm," she told one journalist. "It's about holding people accountable when they abuse their power. What happened here shouldn't happen to anyone else." As the scandal gained national attention, cracks began to form within the HOA itself. Members distanced themselves publicly, issuing statements condemning the fire and denying any involvement. Privately, however, accusations flew back and forth. Richard Langley called emergency meetings attempting to rally the board and present a united front, but his efforts only deepened the divide. Fingers were pointed, alliances crumbled, and trust evaporated entirely. One evening, Ethan received an anonymous tip via email. The sender claimed to have documents proving that the HOA had contracted a local firm specializing in property acquisition strategies to handle difficult cases like Margaret's. Attached to the message were scanned copies of invoices and correspondence between the HOA and the firm, detailing payments for services rendered. Among them was a line item labeled Removal Strategy Implementation, dated just days before the fire. Ethan cross-referenced the information with public records and discovered that the firm had a questionable reputation, with past clients accused of unethical practices. Armed with this new evidence, he contacted law enforcement, urging them to reopen the arson investigation. Detectives reviewed the documents and agreed to question key figures within the HOA, including Richard Langley and several contractors linked to the firm. Word of the impending legal action spread quickly through the neighborhood, sparking panic among those involved. Richard became increasingly erratic, canceling meetings and avoiding interviews. Other board members scrambled to distance themselves, leaking information to reporters in hopes of shifting blame. The once unified HOA dissolved into chaos, its members turning on each other in a desperate bid for self-preservation. Meanwhile, Margaret focused on rebuilding, not just her barn, but her life. With donations pouring in from supporters across the country, she began clearing away the debris and laying the foundation for a new structure. Neighbors who had previously shunned her now approached her cautiously, offering apologies and assistance. Some admitted they had been too afraid to speak out earlier, fearing retaliation from the HOA. Others simply felt guilty for not standing by her sooner. Ethan continued working tirelessly, ensuring the story stayed in the spotlight. He wrote articles for his college newspaper, gave interviews to major outlets, and updated his Reddit thread daily. Each revelation brought more pressure on the HOA, forcing authorities to take the case seriously. Arrest warrants were issued for 2 contractors implicated in the arson, and subpoenas were served to current and former HOA members. For Margaret, justice finally seemed within reach. Though the road ahead would still be long and difficult, she felt a renewed sense of hope. The fire had taken much from her, but it had also ignited a movement, a call for accountability and fairness that resonated far beyond her little corner of the world. As she stood on her porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, Margaret reflected on everything that had happened. The fight wasn't over yet, but she knew she wasn't alone anymore. With Ethan by her side and a community rallying behind her, she faced the future with courage and determination. Whatever came next, she would face it head on, just as she had every challenge before. And somewhere, deep down, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, good could triumph over greed after all.